Beijing has announced that it's investigating French brandy imports, likely paving the way for higher tariffs. It's just the latest in a growing trade dispute between the EU and China, which includes Brussels' investigation into Chinese electric vehicles. Hosuk Lee Makayama is director of the European Center for International Political Economy. He joins me now for more. Hosuk, good to have you on the show. A general question before we really get into the details. How bad can a trade dispute between Brussels and Beijing get?
Well, we saw during the Trump administration that actually a trade dispute can get completely out of hand. But frankly, we are not really there yet. Well, basically what we are seeing is that the European Union has announced that it is investigating Chinese imports of electrical vehicles, whereas China has basically responded in kind and saying that they are investigating brandy. So this is really just a warning shot, and where both sides are looking at each other's position and see who's going to flinch first.
All right, let's remind everyone briefly how we got to this point, where the EU announced 4 months ago that it would investigate subsidies around Chinese production of electric vehicles, as Hosuk just mentioned, which Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the European Commission, has said it could lead to market distortions. Now, that investigation was very much encouraged, even driven by the French government, which is concerned for its own car makers and their efforts to make a splash in the EV market. Now, France has also announced new subsidy rules for EVs to favor local and European car makers. Now, EU officials are also increasingly pointing to the bloc's trade deficit with China. It's doubled from 2020 to a record 366 billion euros in 2022. That is doubled from 2020 to 2022. Figures for the last year, 2023, not yet available, but experts believe that the trade deficit increased even more. Now, China's top export goods to the EU are telecommunications equipment like mobile phones, followed by automatic data processing machines such as computers and servers, and electrical machinery. Let's go back to Hosuk Lee Makayama. You argued, you could argue, I should say, that maybe these two sides actually need each other more than ever, given the shape of their economies right now. If we look at Germany, for example, huge companies with reliances on China, the Chinese economy really struggling in this past year to recover completely from COVID. What is it that's driving them apart exactly, if you had to sum it up?
Well, you're absolutely right. They are quite interdependent. And if you look at the European economy, since the EU and Germany doesn't have much of its own growth, it needs to look at large overseas markets that can absorb a lot of European export. What a lot of people don't actually know is that actually Europe is more export dependent than China. So in other words, if you think China exports too much, Europe is actually even exporting even far more. And now the Chinese economy has been relatively stagnant since the pandemic, yet there are no other major market openings or major pockets of growth out there for a large economy like the European Union that needs roughly an economy of the same size in order to basically make a dent in its GDP. And conversely, if you look at the Chinese economy, it still relies on imports of high tech, and not least in aviation and advanced materials and such, which goes into upgrading its economy. And also, if you look at services, for example, like in banking and other professional services, China is extremely dependent on Europe, especially given the trade war that has been going on between the US and China.
The EU is already worried about climate tech and high-tech sectors given the competition with the U.S. And of course, we're now hearing that EVs are just one part of essentially an oncoming wave of high-tech goods from China as Beijing is really shifting its kind of industrial problem, or industrial production, I should say. What could that mean for the EU? Does that mean that what we're seeing with EVs and the kind of nerves that it's rattling right now amongst domestic producers, are we going to see this in other areas as well, writ large for the coming years?
That is not impossible. I mean, considering that EV was probably one of the least likely sectors that the EU would have addressed. The reason I say this is because half of the imports from China in electrical vehicles is actually American. It's Tesla. Tesla Model Y accounts for almost half of the imports coming in from China. So we are not looking at major numbers of NIO, BYD, and other smaller Chinese manufacturers. And in parallel, we should remember that the Chinese EV industry is actually going in something of a crunch. There is a significant overcapacity because of the subsidies that has been paid out by the central government in order to encourage the industry. And as it turns out, the Chinese EV market for domestic use favors very small cars, and that has typically a range of somewhere between 50 and 100 kilometers. Whereas if you want to export to Europe, you need a range that is perhaps closer to 500 kilometers. That basically means that we have largely seen foreign manufacturers like Volkswagen and Tesla and also BMW that has been making their cars in China and exporting them from Europe. Now, the reason the French car industry and the French government has been encouraging this is, of course, because they don't have their own factories in China. So you could actually look at this not just as an EU-China war, it could also look as a French-German conflict. This is actually as much as a European civil war as an intercontinental trade war.
You could say this goes to show how policy on China, and especially trade with policy, is still very uneven across the continent right now. Does that mean that we're not going to see much more than these investigations? You strongly suggested at the beginning these are investigations, tit for tat in a sense. Do you expect that it could really end at this then, because both sides have no reason to want to really go further with it?
Well, if you speak to French civil servants, they will probably say that they have all the reason to go forward with it, and they will probably add that they are actually not actually behind this at all, and this is all in the name of a European interest. Now, it's very often the case that when it comes to trade conflicts and trade friction, we are looking at short-term interest at hand. And also, it is indeed true that there are a number of distortions and market subsidies that has been paid out by the central government in China. And but it creates a completely different set of winners and losers than you would expect. And now we just heard also about the French subsidies in France. And of course, if French taxpayers are subsidizing purchase of very, very expensive cars in the end, they would very much like this money to go into French industry, not necessarily Chinese, or perhaps not even German. So the national interest is alive and strong across Europe and China.
All right, and the person who is supposed to stand above those national interests to some extent, Ursula von der Leyen, head of the European Commission, she has that tough job of straddling both sides, and even the terminology can sometimes get confusing. We want to play a soundbite from von der Leyen right now. This is really about the difficulty of describing that trade relationship right now. You know, decoupling is a word that gets thrown around. Von der Leyen introduced the term de-risking last year, which other leaders have taken up since then. We heard it with the G7 as well. Let's have a listen to how she describes it at Davos this year, going on right now.
With the Chinese leadership, I have discussed the trade issues of the European Union and basically the principle of de-risk, not decouple. Not decouple is very clear. It's neither reasonable nor feasible. And there are topics where we cooperate, like fighting climate change. But we're very clear and frank on the trade imbalances we have with China, and that the Chinese leadership has to do something about it.
All right, Ursula von der Leyen there at the annual World Economic Forum meetings going on right now in Davos. Let's take a listen to what China says. This is a country that's looking abroad in many ways to kickstart growth. Chinese economy expanding 5.2% last year. That marks actually the weakest performance since 1990, excluding the pandemic years. Now, also at Davos, Chinese Premier Li Qiang has been beating a drum that China is open for business, willing to reform, basically saying whatever message that it hopes Western customers are ready to hear. Let's take a listen to what he said.
In short, no matter how the world situation changes, China will adhere to the basic policy of opening up to the outside world. And the door of opening up will only open wider and wider.
All right, let's go back to Hosokli Makiyama, who's sort of helping us sort through some of the rhetoric and what's actually going on between both sides. I want to start with Ursula von der Leyen and this idea of de-risking versus decoupling. Do we understand what that means? Do both sides really understand what those terms mean?
Well, decoupling has always been seen by economists as well as seasoned trade negotiators as a completely impossible concept. It basically means that you're going to go to North Korea and cut off all trade links. And given how complex the global supply chains are now, and given the role that China plays in global manufacturing and value chains, it is practically an impossible scenario. But when we talk about de-risking, it basically means that we will continue to trade with China, but we will make sure that these interdependency cannot be played so that they cannot be weaponized by China in order to advance Chinese strategic positions in other areas, for example, in foreign policy or questions that are relating to, for example, Taiwan-China relationship. And so we have seen, for example, Lithuania being pressured by the Chinese government, where China has basically cut off all imports from Lithuania for a very brief period. And now you could argue that de-risking would involve making sure that China could not take such a measure. Now, this is, of course, extremely difficult because it is indeed a world of tit of tat. Whatever China can do to Europe, Europe can also do to China. And the interesting fact here is perhaps that China has perceived itself being under the pressure of the West for a very long time. And what they claim is also legitimate developmental aspiration of their own economy as a developing country. This is a rhetoric that continues to come back again and again from the Chinese side. Whereas from our side, we would like to have fair and free trade, and we would like to have reciprocal opening in China. So this is a completely two different views that are conflicting over rhetorics.
I would gather this is also something that's going to be very expensive, especially when we're talking about battery minerals, things like that already. The European Union, the US as well, also looking very much for battery minerals that are largely already extracted and refined in large amounts by China, looking for new sources of that. Is that realistic to expect that they can duplicate that kind of success, finding those minerals, those materials, even extract them locally, things like that, when China obviously has production in place, lower amounts and lower prices, I should say, and doesn't that then conflict with Europe's own decarbonization goals? Have we really seen the rubber meeting the road of where de-risking actually comes into practice?
No, indeed, that's a very good point, because economic security is actually not just about selling to other countries and it is also about sourcing. China has been fairly successful in its rare earth program, across a number of minerals, including lithium and other minerals that it's been using as a means of control for at least the last decade. So, which means that if we don't play nice with China, or if we do something that China doesn't like, they will actually cut down on supplies, and it has a number of means to do that. It could basically introduce environmental controls and standards and artificially suppress production of these valuable minerals in order to make sure that there is nothing left for the overseas market. And this is exactly the kind of pressure that I suppose that the European Union and other countries, notably in G7, is talking about when we are talking about de-risking. But the problem is developing these sources in the OECD economies and G7. It's a very lengthy process, and it's also quite expensive. We need to remember that Europe is pretty much urbanized, and there are not that many places in Europe you can have these extractive industries. And indeed, as the lottery of geology happens to fall out, much of these pockets tend to be in China and other places that are extremely complicated for Europe to reach.
All right, before we wrap up, I want to ask you, just sort of in summary, where is this relationship going in the coming years? The pandemic has also taught a number of lessons about supply chains, or at least thrown supply chains into question like never before. We even see with the Suez Canal right now a reminder that they can be easily disturbed. We see a lot of efforts to bring certain industries over to Europe that may have before been located more in Asia, or at least in China. With that in mind, with some of the human rights issues, with a lot of what we've been talking about now, where is this relationship going in the near term?
Well, I suppose one could say that the last 5 years, during the last European Commission and Parliament, who sits in the period of 5 years, trade policy, and especially relative to China, has been extremely complicated and to some degree frozen. Europe and China actually negotiated an investment agreement that would have opened up the Chinese market for European investment, which was frozen once we went into another circus of strategic sanctions against each other over human rights violations in China, to which China actually retaliated with economic and financial sanctions against both politicians in Brussels as well as academics who are China critical. Now, there is a silent consensus between Beijing and Brussels, and of course, involving also mother-in-laws in Paris and Berlin, that we will revisit this relationship in the coming 5 years, and that we are supposed to take stock and to see if we could reawaken this investment agreement. And now with these micro frictions going on, it's going to be quite difficult to start over on a clean slate. We are piling up issues rather than removing them. And also, at the same time, the Chinese are probably thinking that we fired the first shot, and especially on this time around with this EV investigation. And so that basically means that China pretty much look at Europe and says that the ball is actually in our court. And they are really looking to see how the next 5-year period of the European Commission and the European Parliament, how they're going to play the China game. Are we going to scale down some of these trade frictions and try to rekindle a new relationship, especially in the light of potential return of President Trump and a new, a raveling of the trading system? This is probably the China's calculation, whereas from us, from the European side, we really need certain things, not just in the area of human rights, but also in terms of level playing field, distorting subsidies, and also environmentally distorted practices that take place in China that needs to cease, or at least to some degree, at least some honest attempt to address some of these issues that have been a long-term irritant from the European side.
How different would this relationship be if there were another Chinese leader than Xi Jinping? This is someone who's been incredibly assertive, especially on issues of Taiwan, Hong Kong. His diplomats have been incredibly sharp-elbowed. There's been a change in tone, tenor, and the facts on the ground. What does that mean for this relationship?
Well, in foreign policy, we have a tendency to overplay the role of individual leaders. We have to remember that Xi Jinping is actually a product of the political system, but also the current political environment. Xi, as many other leaders in the China's past, have actually a much less policy space, especially in regards to other major economies like Europe or the United States, than you would believe. They are sovereign, but their options are not endless. That means that they can only play the cards they're being dealt. This is also one of the reasons why you see a very quick reaction to a relatively minor issue coming from the European side, simply because actually the people of China and the business leaders and the party elders expect a quick response. And Chinese leaders, as well as European leaders, must walk a very thin balance where they actually have to think about not damaging their own economy by introducing tariffs that will increase cost for their consumers and their businesses. And this is also one of the reasons why alcohol is a major target against Europe in times of trade war. Alcohol has no immediate productive effect, as far as I can tell, and it's a relatively small share of the global trade. And in addition, you can be very selective when it comes to alcohol. So, for example, if you go after brandy or if you go after wine, certain European countries come to mind. I happen to be Swedish, and I can tell you that Sweden is completely unaffected by those because we can't grow anything up there. And so, in other words, you can selectively target countries that who you want to hold accountable for these trade frictions that have been taken out against China.
All right, well, we're going to have to leave it there for now. I want to thank my guest today, Hosuk Lee Makayama. He's director of the European Center for the International Political Economy. Hosuk, thank you very much for coming on to the show.
Thank you.